Hello, this is Derek Hansen for StrengthPowerSpeed.com. I'd like to welcome you to another episode of our Performance Concepts Chat. In this episode, we're talking with Carl Valle about a particular incident with a college strength and conditioning football program where a number of athletes were hospitalized after a strenuous workout. Now, while other people may be piling on and criticizing and pointing fingers, I think it's important for us to kind of evaluate things from an objective point of view, get as much information as possible, but also look for ways to prevent further such incidences in the future. So Carl and I get into some deeper discussion, weighing different factors, but also identifying potential solutions for moving forward, not just with one particular university, but for the field and other sports in particular. So I hope you enjoy the conversation. And we're looking forward again for more feedback on some of the topics we identify. So hope you enjoy this. Thank you. Hey, Carl, thanks for joining me on short notice here. I just wanted to go over some of these recent conversations on the incident at a specific football program, NCAA Division I football program. And I don't know if we need to get into the specifics of who's involved and all that, but I know that even in our conversations and messaging back and forth, I think we wanted to get to a point of asking some deeper, more specific questions before everybody piles on and jokes about this. And then the other part of it is, where is this going to go? What has this incident done to increase awareness and possibly lead to some solutions?
Yeah, I think, Derek, if we can set the tone up that, our intention is not to try to be an ambulance chaser or pile on or just try to look like an armchair quarterback and say, oh, this, it's easy to speculate when you don't have all the information. Even when you're in the, at the university itself, you're not even seeing the whole picture. I mean, the only person that really knows what's truly going on is probably the athlete because they know the story behind the story. And I think it's fair, let's not be scared. We're not here to criticize. I'm not here to point fingers. I think the purpose of here is to start saying, let's use what happened and then think about the 30,000 foot view of things that are close or proxy to the problem. What's acceptable? So I think before we start moving on of using euphemisms and trying to avoid the elephant in the room, let's cut to the chase. We're not here this is a topic. We're just journalists almost. Is the University of Oregon had a problem with the football program where a couple athletes were hospitalized for rhabdo. And I think anyone that knows exercise science or a coach, that we all know that rhabdo is is pretty much an overexertion syndrome. And, symptoms are, there's risks. I mean, you're having, when you urinate, you're bleeding and it's just bad for the internal part of your body. Oregon's the state of Oregon is they're not, this is not new to them. This happened with a high school football program, apparently years before. And so what we want to do is start talking about, specifically the training, the politics, and the bigger picture. I think that there's a tip of the iceberg problem, and people are looking at the symptoms versus seeing why is this happening again in 2017, and is it not going to happen again? Can anyone say like, oh, finally we can put, this behind us? This is just sort of like Ebola. We had a little bit of a spell, and now we won't see that again because we've cured the problem. And the truth of the matter is we're probably going to see this at lower levels, and we're going to have the same pundits, the same articles, and time for change and all this other stuff. So I think that's kind of a nice outline before we start reviewing these excellent questions that you and John have brought up.
Yeah, and I think, like you said, let's try to come up with some better understanding of what went on. I know one of the things that I wrote down is, do we know what really happened? What are the facts? What was the nature of the workout? I know I heard it was an hour of continuous push-ups and up downs or squats, body weight squats, which, maybe for the average person, they're like, push-ups and squats, body weight squats, what's the big deal? But there's obviously more to it than that. And obviously the context of it being the first workout of the season, the incoming coaching staff, wanting to set some sort of tone, we're coming in. But we don't know, was there any work given from the time that they finished, and they didn't have a bowl game, so they had a lot more time off. Was there any voluntary program given to them to kind of lead them up to this point where the new staff transitions? What do you know about it?
Yeah, and so what I'm going to probably share is the most obvious things, which is what are the known knowns, which is what we've identified is we have a new head coach and a new head strength coach. And what we have is obviously the existing teams. This is January, so it's not like, there's new recruits. It's the same ingredients, the same athletes. And I think we need to actually rewind further before we start getting into what happened in January. Start looking at what happened to University of Oregon football when Chip Kelly left. I think there's a little bit of history that's necessary. We do know that Oregon obviously is well connected with Nike, the new facilities people are talking about. I mean, it's just a lot of elements that people want to talk about that connect and that are integrated into this conversation. To summarize it simply, we have a new coach in terms of football program trying to set a tone from losing. And anytime you have a new coach, it's because either you're hiring you're enhancing the program or you're trying to reboot. So, for example, what's happening here is that there was the program was not successful as it was earlier, so they decided to make a staff change, specifically with the coaching and then like with anything, I think people have to remember is that usually when you hire a head coach, the head coach brings his guy or the strength and conditioning coach with them. And you tend to see that with assistant coaches as they get hired. They tend to try to bring the assistant strength coach because they want to bring people that are known knowns. So that we know that. The second thing is there's a belief that was before even Oregon got there that the team quit on training because they were losing. That there was, and you can look that up, is that, when anyone's winning, maybe attendance in the weight room and efforts are high, but when you're losing, that's when people tend to disappear. So now you have a bigger problem, which is the access to the athlete, NCAA rules. And so ironically enough, the rules, just like the collective bargaining agreement, are making it harder for people to succeed. And you're seeing these problems surface saying, oh, shoot, we have less time, or we need to make a change immediately because we don't even know if we have a year or two to really get enough change so that we can keep our jobs. So very similar to the NFL, we're seeing injuries happen because the reactionary approach of whoever is designing these rules, it's not helping. So I think what we do know is that, hey, there's some workouts, whether it became a bunch of body weight exercises and some toughness building, or whether it be conditioning, who knows what it was, but we know what the results was. The results were very simple. 3 guys went to the hospital. And I think people don't really know what rhabdo is. Rhabdomyolysis is we understand that it's an exertional injury, centrically damage, and people talk about creatine kinase and other biomarkers. But the thing is that if someone's hospitalized and they get better in a few days and there's no permanent damage, I think rhabdo, not that it's a small problem, is I think we accept non-contact injuries that can limit someone enjoying sports later in their life, like playing golf. And we give hospitalizations with surgery a pass. Hey, I didn't cause rhabdo, so now I'm in the clear, but I had 6 guys go down with non-contact injuries in training, like an ACL rupture or an ACL tear. So Achilles, a knee issue, a back issue during, some sort of obscenely, shock method of squatting, you can see where I'm going.
Yeah, and I know I've spoken to some others about this, and people can be on either side of the fence. And one thing that was brought up was, well, we got over 100 athletes here, and we only had 3 get. And how come the other guys didn't get it? Can we blame the programming or the exercises? Because, for some reason, only 3 guys got rhabdo. And I even saw some comments from some of the fellow players like, hey, what's the big deal? Like, only 3 of our guys, the rest of us are fine. And I think that still goes back to this fact checking is, well, was everybody else fine, even though they didn't require hospitalization? How much muscle soreness did they experience post-workout? How much is acceptable? I think those are other questions that have been brought up. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's an interesting statistic. Let's say you just round for convenient numbers is 100 athletes on the football program, and only 3 had rhabdo, right? Does that mean you should give them the program an A for a 97%? Right? I mean, how do you evaluate something like that? And another question is why if we had to look at what clinically happened, from, and then what was actually actionable, meaning, was it really 3 guys that had rhabdo and then the rest just kind of went to their dorm room and just drank water and recovered on their own? There's no anti-rhabdo serum or it's not like an antidote virus type thing. It's kind of like your passive rest is a huge influence. So I think what happens is in these situations, it's very hard to evaluate what happened because, like I said earlier, you say you have some guys that are taking some time off, they're slacking, and then you have guys that are scared to lose conditioning and they're training on their own. I wouldn't see it as a summary statistic of, 3 out of 100, it's not a problem, because it's really an N of 1. Each athlete is valuable. Each athlete's someone's daughter or son. So we have to treat it like an N of 1 situation and then scale it and say, okay, what's the situation with each athlete? And say, why did these 3 guys have it? Now, I'm not saying this is a poor man's genetics test to say who needs to go and go to Athletogen and do or DNA Fit or 23andMe when we can do the old school method of just see who breaks down and then just choose those 97 guys to be on the team and try to have those other 3 guys kind of move along and be a shot putter or something like that.
Well, I mean, that's a really good point. I mean, I know that there was some talk from the head coach that as he was coming in, he's like, one of the reasons we haven't been winning or the program hasn't been winning is lack of conditioning or lack of fitness. Now, you and I could probably stand on the sidelines and assess that better than most head coaches, but do you think there was any evaluation done prior to these workouts to say, like, yes, you guys are in really bad shape or you guys haven't been putting in the time? Has there been any sort of objective way of coming to this rather than just using a sweeping statement? And that's an easy one because I've heard it. I've even heard it myself, like, the reason why you guys are losing is because of poor conditioning. There's so many factors. What are your thoughts on that? Somebody coming in, no evaluation, eyeballing the situation and saying, yep, that's the reason why you guys aren't winning.
Yeah, I mean, that's a question. It's like it's the eye of the beholder, like, and if that's the case is, the first question is, and this is where people that know college football is that the blur offense was sort of like an indication of saying, look at the demands of the athletes that have to be able to rest for very abbreviated, periods than their norms, than the common, whatever the average, if you will, rest period between plays. And then, of course, you have to play explosively. So, if that was the case, why don't they just switch the strength coach? Why did you hire a team coach? It's like, hey, listen, their X's and O's are great. But apparently the team coach, and I don't know what happened. I'm just hearing this is always replace whatever the scenario is with any type of universal principle, which is the team coach is saying that the issue is strength and conditioning. what if the strength and conditioning coach said, you know what, if we had a spread offense, things would be different. I mean, I think there's a point where you have to overlap professions. But again, how do you evaluate that? Even game film, and you do breakdown, yeah, you can get some velocities, but you're not dealing with such a differentiation that, it's not that Oregon is like the bottom 100 of sports performance. It's very hard when there's so much commonalities between programs. Everyone's trying to go and do, manage a limited amount of time. They're recruiting, so I find that probably unlikely. It's probably like, well, these guys aren't tough, or these guys don't have fourth quarter conditioning, or they're not taking hits, or something abstract, which is very difficult to measure or even discuss theoretically. So I don't like any speculation of what's happening if I'm not there, and even if I'm there for in the organization. Usually people like myself are looking to other mentors to figure out what the big picture is. So I'm very cautious, even if I'm in the trenches with those people, for me to, I have the answer,
Yeah, no, I entirely agree. And, I've those unmeasurables, like somebody comes in, what's the first thing they say? Well, we need to work harder, work ethic, culture, character. But nobody's saying like, hey, the guy at this position is not suitable, whether it's, his height, his speed, his weight, or whatever, or he can't catch, or I've never really seen that. I've never seen that analysis. It's always these intangibles, right?
These cliche.
Yeah.
Vague. Yeah. What guy says, you know what? If I ever come to a new job, I'm gonna say, you know what? Yeah, I'm gonna work hard. The previous guys, I'd be interested to see what the hiring process. We hired a guy, and he said that he was going to be hardworking 4 years ago, but he was secretly lazy. And when we did a background check, everyone covered for him. They said, "Oh, he's the hardest working guy." Well, there's two ways you can look at that. Where he got in the earlier job before that, he was able to sucker people in, and then it's too late when you hire him. Or the fact is, everyone's going to say the same stuff. Hey, team culture. We're going to change culture, right?
Yeah.
Well, okay. Everyone says that. So apparently everyone but the national champion has a culture problem.
Yep.
Right? We're going to work hard. Well, clearly there's some effort there. The issue was that it was misdirected probably. And, all these other, quote, intangibles, people love rattling them off because everyone feels good in a meeting. But on Monday you come home and like, man, how come I'm not feeling, it's like those posters that you used to see 20 years ago, like excellence. We're going to be committed to excellence. That's like the whole joke of I'm a high performance advisor versus the low performance advisor. These buzzwords like, culture and commitment, and, they're great. I mean, some teams have spent like $20,000 on stenciling these quotes and these statements. And, I believe in some of that stuff makes a difference psychologically. But what happens if you like commit to painting a term like excellence in the weight room, and after year 3, people are like, you know what? Is there something out there besides excellence? What about perfection or mastery? It just becomes almost a running joke because it loses its luster.
Yeah, because you watched the national championship game too, and the winning team, were people saying, "Oh, Clemson has absolutely great character and culture, and that's why they won." No, the quarterback was fantastic, right? So it's interesting how they switch these things around. Like, have you ever heard of somebody come into a job and say, "You know what? 80% of our players are really bad, and we got to get rid of them and recruit over them." But nobody's going to say that because then 80 guys are going to quit and you got very little left. But I guess that's why it's easier to say culture and, to use a James Smith quote, the Easter Bunny was causing problems for us or something. But yeah, I just find it interesting. Now, the other part
I cut you off.
Yeah.
We're seeing an influx of more of that stuff. You think that
oh, yeah.
science is going to start seeping in more, what I'm seeing is this really bizarre and uncomfortable. This is uncomfortable for me. Is I'm seeing this huge wave. You think that now that science is progressing, we're seeing a lot of problems with anti-science. And I'm not talking about, this is not a sports science issue. This is logic and reasoning. I don't want to make it people think it's going to be all about GPS and heart rate variability and bar speed and all the stuff that, that's gaining momentum. But the reality is that how many coaches are eating the stuff up, where it's like, I'm connecting to players better than anyone, or, we're pursuing, we're looking at the horizon. It's like, you're looking to the horizon. It's like, all these Braveheart speeches, all that stuff. I understand there's a place for it, and I think it's essential. But what we're seeing is a focus on not intangibles, is unmeasurables.
Yep.
And I'm not saying that you can measure everything and everything's worth measuring, but it's pretty wimpy. It's a cowardly to stay most of your efforts into a way that you can't self-evaluate, or a third party can't come in there and say, okay, I'm seeing the Easter Bunny too. Everyone has, if there's an Easter Bunny, great. In a couple of months, we'll find out. But if not everyone can see the Easter Bunny, you probably is just using a way to dodge the obvious, which is a coaching deficit, either a technology deficit, some sort of X's and O's. There's a problem with simple coaching, the team sports stuff. So I hated to interject, but when you said intangibles, my heart sank, because we're seeing a focus on this stuff more and more. And it's great that we have, these Newt Rockne and stuff from the 60s and 70s, but our same problems that we're seeing with people not drinking water or getting punishment runs, I think that we're seeing this punishment mentality still, continue to spread, even with all these type of, feel good and, sports psychology pseudosciences,
I mean, that's a really good point. So why, you and I have been involved in a lot of professional development events, conferences, workshops, and all that. And it seems like, from at least a physical preparation point of view, a lot of those events are dominated by sports science topics. Like, I don't know how many events I've been to where people are like, "Hey, this is the mental toughness conference or the Easter the Easter Bunny conference." But so we have that growing, and amongst ourselves, we're like, "Yeah, okay, this is pretty interesting." But like you said, on the other side of the spectrum is this mental toughness and military training and character building, and why is there a growth at both ends of the spectrum? No integration, it seems. What do you think's going on? Is it a societal thing?
Well, yes and no. Obviously, sport is a microcosm of what we're seeing in globally. With it's hard to isolate the the societal and sport connection. But what you're saying is, yeah, where is the it's funny. It's like this underground, like the military side. If I put on my resume that I worked with special forces, would someone be just as excited as if I say, okay, I worked with, lawn care, right? And this is not a joke, but like, I think that people look at the military as a sign of saying, okay, you got NASA on top, then you got military, right? Then you got law enforcement, maybe SWAT, and then you got sport. It's a trickle-down effect. And then they say, well, if I'm doing all this stuff, let's look to those people as to guide sport. And I like the fact that you can learn from different disciplines. I'm the guy that's probably the most guilty of looking for outside the box ways. But what we're seeing now is, everyone's making fun of boot camps for soccer moms, yet the routine is just the same thing, except you've maybe changed the people doing it. You're doing body weight exercises, so it's hard. And, you're doing log runs on the beach, and you're waking up early, and, that's the way to develop toughness. Now, as you know, I am also a big fan of, what I've learned from Coach Francis. You don't get confidence from a psychologist's couch. You get it from being physically ready. So, now there is something that, all being equal, two guys that are equally fit. It's the fourth quarter. There's something between the ears that's going to probably create an advantage. I understand that. But I think that the growing responsibilities of a strength coach is what's happening is everyone's trying to be more generalist. And then on the same time, you have all these departments that are not operating on the same page. Everyone says, yeah, we're connected. We have discussions. We're not in silos. But then what happens? You tend to see these problems surface. So I think it's getting worse. I think people are being more divided. And I'm not trying to make a political joke with who getting with the protesters for Donald Trump today. But we're seeing a lot of division. You're seeing a lot of people say, hey, I'm a whatever 3-letter acronym person. It used to be, hey, I'm an FMS person, or I'm a PRI person, or I'm an SAQ person. And, I like specialization and expertise, but it's not helping. The FMS, were they FMSing the Oregon players? How did that work out? It just doesn't make any sense. I think that we have to be honest here, and we know that the problems that you're seeing are only a tip of the iceberg, like I said earlier, because the problems you don't see means it's probably worse. So, at least they're going to a conference trying to get educated, or, that there is a conference for these topics to educate people. What's even scarier is that we're seeing the same workouts that are, everyone says it's inappropriate, it's inhumane, it's borderline negligence to the point where you can have a lawsuit. You're killing people. And I think that's kind of a safe bet to say that there needs to be a lot more change than just saying, okay, we need to change the conference structure.
Yeah, well, even if we get into this idea of rules, and obviously the knee-jerk reaction is going to be, well, the NCAA has to get in there and tighten things up. But I mean, as you mentioned earlier, is the NCAA part of the problem in terms of segregating the times that you can train people, and then contracting the amount of time you can do as well? And like you said with the CBA, now you've contracted everything, so the density goes up, or people just want to go in and say, hey, we only have this many weeks to get these guys ready, so we got to hit them hard.
We got to roll the dice more. Yeah. And that's what happens, is to say, hey, I need 16 weeks to prepare guys. I got 10 weeks, so now I have a density issue. It's same thing with snap counts. Guy says, well, we need to know plays. So, and we only have a certain amount of time. What's the solution? Do more with less. And that's a real scenario, not just with strength and conditioning, with everything. Is time is the ultimate enemy. And like I said earlier, people are rolling the dice and say, you know what? Let's do the same program and, tweak things. When each time there's a change in resources, whether it be time, facilities, or even the talent of the athletes themselves, it's almost like you got to start off from scratch a little bit, because it's nice and convenient to kind of retell the jokes, but the laughs are not going to be the same if you change the crowd, So I just think that what you're saying is the NCAAs might have created constraints, but with any good coach, you're going to have to be flexible and change. So, because everyone has apparently the same rules. I understand that there is abuse. I mean, there's penalization for that. But regardless if there's rules or not, there's biological laws. There's biological rules that say, even if you can skirt the issue, you're still got to pay the piper physically down the road. And that's what happened.
Yeah, good point. Good point. Now, in terms of the hiring practices for strength coaches, and even this idea that they're bringing up, like, oh, was this guy certified? Was he qualified? I support certification to a certain extent, but how do you vet these employees? Like, and how do administrators have the know-how and knowledge to know what is a good strength coach? Obviously, they're giving people a free pass because the head coach wants the guy, and I trust this guy, and this is my guy. But is there a better way to kind of vet these hires?
So there's two things: the way people are hired and the way people are licensed and certified and things like that. So the first problem I have is that certification should be about not being dangerous. So what you're trying to do with certification is not really make better strength coaches, is to make sure that people aren't going to have friendly fire, that you're not causing problems with the people that you're working with.
Like a driver's license.
Sort of like a driver's license, to say, hey, you're not dangerous to yourself and other people, right? Which is a low standard. I understand that, that's not something to be proud of. I mean, that's why there's levels, there's ways to evaluate. USA Track and Field has a certification process that I like. It's like, okay, level 1 shows that you've been exposed to, simple principles. Some of them should be ethical. Second level is to say, hey, you have some expertise somewhere. And the third one's you have kind of mastery. The issue with this pass-fail type of approach, I had my CSCS for many years. And then there was a point where someone won a coach of the year. And, within that month or so, there was videos showing not negligence, but it was just like those videos to say, how can you be, voted, if you will. Now, we can make more Trump jokes with that type of stuff, but my whole point is, my concern is that, like you said, certifications exploded in the 90s, in the 2000s. I'm only 39, so I'm sure that this has been an ongoing saga, but certifications can go out of control. I think that there needs to be, if you look at other countries and how they evaluate strength conditioning coaches, there's like USA weightlifting. Look at that. You got to be able to do the lifts, like at least say, can you grab a bar and do something? It's not perfect. So certifications, I think that's one level to say, hey, you're not doing anything foolish. And I think if you add in an ethical component saying you're responsible for someone else's, body and mind, I think a lot of these problems won't happen, because there is a line that you draw when you're trying to achieve something that is not going to get someone better. No one thinks that if they did those programs, someone's going to be able to dunk from the 3-point line. Those were about using exercise as a way to tap into areas that might not respond that way. Who knows? Or what if the person was just trying hard and was just, like I said on the phone call, that instead of 100, he thought it was 1,000. Because maybe there's an educational deficit. I'm not here to really just say what happened, because I don't know. But what we do know, what could have happened, which is there's an education problem. There's an ethical problem, whether someone knows better, but they chose not to do what they believe. Everyone's using the code red, saying, hey, we know that's not helping them, but we're trying to teach them something different through a medium, which is maybe probably inappropriate. I'm not against, I'm against punishment exercise, because I think that's the wrong thing. I mean, I like, if I was to kick out an athlete from practice, to me, that would be punishment, because they're not getting better. They have to watch even their own competitors. If you're on the team and you're running the 100-meter dash, you're competing against everyone. So you have to watch your competition get better. Then we get into the hiring process. I'll switch quickly because of time. Does anyone think that there's a hiring process that they're proud of? That if they put this on reality TV and said, top strength coach versus top chef, could you imagine what we would see? We'd see a lot of nepotism. We'd see a lot of just who you know. We'd see a lot of dressed up CVs. And then sometimes you'll just see hey, that was a good risk because that guy is a hidden gem. There's a guy named Brendan Ziegler at the University of Bakersfield. Now, if I said, go visit him, I'd probably get a couple people pausing. One guy might roll their eyes. Well, he's not at an SEC school, or what has he done? But what happens is we're looking at biography over biology, which is something I stole 10 years ago. That whole idea of like, it's the who you know and the CV style versus do you do a good job? So evaluating what you've done with what you have with who you have is very difficult, and I think that's why the process needs to be rebooted. And there needs to be someone like yourself out there to maybe work with not athletic departments, but the actual team coaches. The biggest gap, I think, are team coaches. They could just be really knowledgeable about the X's and O's, but most of them don't have a little bit of a light physiology or light sports science background just to have awareness or some framework. And I think that will happen. That will actually change things. But I think that coaches now are so much more sophisticated on the X's and O's that they just don't have the bandwidth to do all the other things. I mean, high school level, you might have a head strength coach that will spend a little time. A head football coach might be a part-time strength coach, so that he'll see the blending of the two different elements. But I don't think you're seeing that now in this day and age, or it's been so long ago they lost touch. So I think the future, and I've mentioned this so many times on podcasts or interviews, is someone's going to say, I'm going to write whether it be a very brief 20-page book or it's a whole bunch of infographics, and say, here's sports science, sports coaching, not just the PhD stuff, that, the applied coaching side, and say, here's where a balance is, the art and science 101. So a coach can say, you know what? I know now enough to make a hiring decision. I'm educated, because all you know is what's around you.
Yeah. And, we can talk a lot about this idea that coaches need to be more knowledgeable, but I mean, do you think the culture of strength and conditioning has kind of gone off the rails in American college sport? You think it's broken in some regards? I mean, the salaries are going up, and like you said, people are being measured by the program they're associated with or how much money they make, rather than maybe the actual work they're doing.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how to solve that, but I do know that while we have problems now, I think it's easy to say in hindsight that, okay, this is spiraling out of control. When the reality is, I think the awareness has increased. I think there's, concussions, for example. Are we getting more concussions, or we just value the health and well-being of the player more? So I don't have any statistics to say, yes, the overtraining and risks of rhabdo has done this over the last 20 years. What I do believe is happening is that I do think actually things are improving. The problem is the gap isn't closing. So there's a lot of talented, smart guys out there that just, they get so frustrated because they're not seeing much change. But to say it's getting worse or spiraling out of control, it's like, yes, the military training, but it's always been that way. You think that strength coaches or team coaches were, baristas and calm and patient and, 20 years ago, and then somehow they're yelling all the time? I would say that the personalities, because there is more education, it's improving, but the discrepancy between the lowest of the low, right, and the best of the best got wider. So I think that the gap has become really large enough that the average or the median or mean and the typical coach knows better, but I don't think that the majority of the people are abusive like that. In the U.S., people will sue. It's just this litigation world that we live in. And the fact we visibly have smartphones, you just can't do anything and get away with it anymore, So I think the problem is there, and it's getting more frustrating because it's been decades and we still see the same problems. But to say it's like, we're doomed, sports science is dead, and the sky is falling. I think that there's a lot of work to be done. So that's why we're having this discussion now. The fact that we're having an honest and open discussion is key. I have not seen this. I've seen that people have agendas. My agenda is to hopefully get people inspired to do something creative to improve the field. It might not change the injury patterns, but if it helps other areas, maybe it helps eating disorders, maybe it helps with at home, so the athlete doesn't improve just on health and wellness physically, but a lot of times athletes are coming from really challenging, like Randy Ballard, a lot of challenging problems from when they're growing up, and all these issues. So I think the health and well-being, there's the saying I've said a few times: good sport begins when good health ends. And I think people are starting to understand that it's the long-term effects of concussions, but you don't need to have your bell rung a few times to know that there's other things besides concussions that we have to worry about.
Yeah, and it kind of transitions into my next kind of topic, which is this idea of mental toughness as part of athlete preparation, and I've talked to others about this, and I'll continue talking about it. And also, the mental toughness being part of the culture of football. And there was a long distance running coach who wrote an article about like football is creating problems for strength and conditioning. While I can't necessarily agree with that, I understand where he's coming from, and even being within, I think, a university where you may be another sport and you see what's happening with football kind of from the internals of your situation, I can see why people see football being a bit of a problem. Now, is it a football problem? Is it a people problem in your opinion, in terms of the yelling and screaming and like we're tough and the aggression and all that?
Well, a couple things. I think it's a fair question. Was it a toughness issue? Would there be any headlines on ESPN if there was no physical injury? I doubt it. Unless you're, someone's shouting at you and said something, God forbid, racial, a hate attack or something said. You've seen this with head coaches. There's one basketball head coach that was throwing chairs or throwing balls at the athletes and physically attacking them. And that corporal punishment for parenting. I mean, I don't want to get to that. It's a very, I don't want to touch that Pandora's box of, spanking children and getting down to that level, what's acceptable. But what we do know is that the fact that someone's hospitalized, what if someone felt that they were bullied and they went to a psychologist versus a, medical doctor? Would there be the same response? I think that you go to the hospital trumps anything that else, because people say, okay, there is definite acute physical evidence of damage. Now let's get into the other component, which is football ruining strength and conditioning, right? Meaning football gives all these problems that are happening, quote, with football, because it is a different sport. So let's talk about endurance sport and defining toughness. Everyone's going to have their own definition because, there's going to be some bias. Like, for example, when I was on the swim team, wrestling was the tough sport. You got the overnight, you got Vision Quest and all the stuff. And swimming, you're in Speedos and you're in the pool, right? So one of the things that my neighbor, Matt, was the captain of the swim team the year before I was. And he says, do you think swimmers are tougher than wrestlers? And I said, there is one component to be, is hurting someone else tough, or is hurting yourself tough? And I felt like, well, if you train really hard, you're tough. And I kind of agree that, yeah, if you're experiencing discomfort, there's something to be said to be overcoming it. But also toughness means you're dropping the pint of ice cream when you don't need to. I mean, those are other things besides physical toughness. So definition, it's easy. Everyone can go and say, well, this is our definition of toughness. It's cool under fire. It's this or that. I mean, is it tough to show that you're crying? Or you're afraid to show your emotions? You can't win that argument. But what I think is to say, what's effective mental training? I'm not saying that you don't have to explore toughness, but I think there's something to be said is, unless you're actually got skin in the game and you can see a team besides the physical fitness side, if they quit, because you've seen this happens with a losing team. What teams turn around? They start off slow, but they believe in the coach or they believe in the system. It's very difficult to tease out what toughness is. And Dr. John Sullivan, he's the Easter Bunny Terminator, because what he does is like, you get all excited about grit, and you're like, grit, TED Talk. I'm all excited. I'm going to buy 3 books. I'm going to tweet the covers on them to show everyone I'm smart. And then he says, grit is dead. You're like, there goes my opportunity to, finally solve that grit problem or that gap in my system. So I think that we need to start looking and saying, are we mentally prepared, right? And what does that look like? How do we evaluate that? And can you prove that you're doing it? A lot of people say, they show these pictures and screenshots of PDFs of sports psychology research. Like, man, this guy he's doing internal, external focus. This guy is amazing. But then you realize that it's easy to say that you're doing something. You have to, there's the whole thing of show but not tell. So until you actually show a football team winning because they are mentally tougher, it's best to say, okay, getting hospitalized is not helping. Okay, but what would be the threshold? If I guaranteed a football coach to say, you know what, we're going to lose a couple athletes to a broken foot, maybe a couple kids are going to have a third grade 3 hamstring tear and you'll have limping issues, but I guarantee you a national title, right? What's the threshold? People say that rhabdo is definitely the threshold. Is it people quitting the sport? Is it people that, is there a physical and mental threshold to say, no, we can't go beyond that line? What's the line in the sand? Are you allowed to yell because you lose your temper? You can never yell. I mean, things are changing now. And I think that there's something to be said is that if you go to a hostile situation and you're in amazing aerobic shape, you can clean the house, you're agile, everything's there, you got lean body fat, and then you go and someone is screaming at you and saying things that make your soul burn, are you going to be distracted? How are you going to handle that? You can't say, well, my VO2 max was increased, therefore I can handle someone talking trash about my family. And it's not just that. It's just like, okay, there's a difference between acidosis and someone hitting you. And I'm not to say that you need to get hit in order to absorb hits, but there's something specific about it. Everyone's complaining about, they're wearing pads and stuff like that. Well, that's specific. But then if you do too much of it, you're not caring about the athlete. So the same peanut gallery that's saying you shouldn't do this are saying the exact opposite 2 years earlier when the opposite is true. These guys are hitting too much. But then you're saying, well, that's not specific to the sport, having them do tough training, not hitting. And then you say, well, you can't do toughness training because toughness training doesn't work. But then they never give an alternative suggestion to say, here is an example of the 3 or 4 football teams that are not doing, Navy SEAL TRX circuits till you puke. This is what they're doing. And then everyone should model it. They never give examples. Or they go into history of saying, well, Bill Walsh, he came from San Jose State, and he was during the 1960s with Bud Winter and all this stuff, and no one yelled. Okay, maybe that worked for Bill Walsh. Does that mean that no one's ever won a Super Bowl by not yelling? Everyone that wins Super Bowls means they're not yelling. I mean, that's where I'm going at. I mean, it's convoluted, but it's too easy on the sidelines to tell what people are doing wrong when you have no evidence that you yourself have witnessed. Forget about doing it yourself. Witness what the perfect model is, because then you'd see everyone copying that. Again, whoever has the best quarterback usually has the strength coach of the year, right? So the question is, if someone's winning because of the horse whisperer attitude, show us that. Because I think that everyone's excited about Clemson winning because they assume that because obviously Scott down in Alabama is yelling. Well, they still won a lot of games. They kicked a lot of butt. And I would say that probably Clemson had a really good coach too. They didn't lose because Scotty was screaming during the stretching. It just football won. The players win. Just like Bill Belichick said, it's not the fans that win the games, it's the players on the field. So I think that Clemson, obviously some very talented people, they did a good job. They beat a very good team. But what you do for an encore, we know that, hey, Clemson won. It's not like Alabama lost. Now, Lane departing their offense, and, they weren't passing like, the greatest show on turf. It wasn't like 340 yards passing. So, there's the football things that lost. I don't think that strength and conditioning won or lost that game. I think, obviously, those guys were in amazing shape. And if you saw Bo in 10th grade, clearly his DNA is pretty good, Anyway, sorry about the rant. I just wanted to make sure that's out there.
Okay, well, that being said, and having gone through this week of people pointing fingers and saying, this is the reason the guys got rhabdo and this is what should happen, where do we go from here? Like, how do, and I don't want to, I've written down how do we fix the problem, but I don't think that's an appropriate way of saying it. But how do we move forward to improve the situation for everyone, and not just at that particular university, but how do we raise the awareness and and provide the education so that we can move forward? And you've touched on it a bit with connecting with sport coaches, but are there guidelines we can set up, or
yeah, you'll be surprised. I think that a good solution is to start saying, okay, the American Swim Coaches Association has something called the Gold Medal Clinic. Now, I haven't gone to one, but I used to collect all the books, the world books. And I loved it. You know why? Because the presentation was, here's the workouts for what we did to earn the medal, right? And I'm going to talk about it. So there's two things that were really important. Completeness, which is kind of showing the transparency of everything. Meaning, hey, here's what we did, and making sure that you can see what we did. So that instead of having bullet point slides, and this is where Dave Tenney starts to grin, because he knows I hate even my own presentation at the NSCA conference. What I should have done is showed, and I'm going to do this on my next presentation, is just show a video clip of like, what does that look like? Now there's a difference between me talking about principles versus the situation here, which is, who cares what you believed in? We'll talk about that later, how you made your decisions. What did you do?
Yeah, that's
transparency.
That's a really good point, because even the last workshop that I had for the IFAS guys, like, I think one of the most useful things I did was I just showed video of me working with some athletes and saying, these are the issues, and then you saw how I resolved them just real time almost. That was probably the most valuable part of my presentation, not the slides.
Yeah, the real time is nice, but a lot of the stuff that and I was told, Matt is a coach that I worked with who was my intern, and after 2 weeks he said to me privately, because I don't want to hurt your feelings, but your training's boring. And And I said, well, do the athletes think it's boring? Well, there's music, you throw on medicine balls, someone's friendly, telling some jokes. Maybe the experience isn't boring, but yeah, it was repetitive and it was subtle changes, meaning no one got magically better overnight. So this whole thing, everyone goes to visits training to say, does that one session a coach is going to have magical words, right? So that's what people do is they look for, and I'll get back to your point, but it's magical words or cues. It's the workouts that are magical. Oh, send me his workouts, which is the magical scroll, right? Or it's something else that's like, okay, it's a magical wand. What does he use for, equipment?
Yes.
So those are the three things: the magical words, abracadabra, Harry Potter wand. What does he have for?
But
bar velocity?
Isn't that's partially the fault of the people who are putting themselves out there and they're looking for these little gimmicks or these things, and that's what represents their training. Like, you need this drill, or you need this piece of equipment, or you need this technology, and I think that kind of feeds that frenzy, don't you?
Yeah, and I'll be very honest. A lot of people see me as sports technology, a little bit of data, track and field. Now, my specialty, believe it or not, is technology. Is the only reason I'm standing out is because there might be an advantage that I have, but I think it's like 1/5 of what I do. Now, I'm capitalizing more on the 1/5 than, does anyone really care about, recovery regeneration 10 years ago was everyone was interested in, so I've always split myself into fifths, but usually what's the trend or the hot hand is what people want to play. So let's get back to solutions. We talked about transparency. Not one person has said, okay, here's the workout. And it took years after another, every incident is going to say, what's the workout, right? And there was one baseball team, I'm not going to mention, that had an issue at the end of the season, and it took them 2 or 3 weeks to do an investigation. That was a player body weights. Did the athletes get heavy? Now, I'm sorry, in this day and age of technology and science, do you really need 3 weeks to figure out what someone, it's like the deflate gate. Now, that's a whole different ball of wax, but like, do you really need to take weeks of investigation to figure out what was done? It should be like, okay, coach, send us the workouts that you planned, what you did, any notes for the week or two, that the week before, the week after, and then present, right? Say, hey, day one, we did this. The reason I came to this conclusion is because I've been doing this workout for 10 years, never had a problem. Okay. Then you look back and say, was there ever a problem at the other universities or other high schools, whatever? I think we don't have what I consider forensic evaluation. There is no process to say, okay, an incident happened. There's no wolf. Remember the wolf from Pulp Fiction? Who's the wolf of rhabdo, or who's the wolf of problems? No one has a disaster plan for any organization with this stuff. So you had problems at Penn State, a very serious problem, but it's just everyone's so encumbered with not having a process. So besides, God forbid, any of this stuff repeats again, does anyone going to say, you know what? How do we have a disaster plan? So the first thing is a disaster plan to say, what's the communication if it does happen? How do we not hide the problem with media, but how do we make changes? Now, they made a change. The people, there's 2 people that are part of the performance in sports science, and I think that makes sense. A sports scientist should be connected with the coach. I'm not saying who should be on top of the totem pole. If I say, hey, a strength and conditioning coach should report to the, can you see me?
Yeah, I got your back.
Yeah, sorry, the battery is dying. The technology.
Yeah, my light went out too, so obviously, it's like the music at the Academy Awards during the acceptance speeches. So.
That's why I always enjoy talking to you. Your jokes always keep me a couple of years younger. But like what I was saying is that, the totem pole. Like, I'm not saying that there needs to be a director of performance and then sports science is underneath or whatever. We need to get away from a hierarchy that's looks like org charts and 1980s computers. Like, okay, vice president of marketing, and underneath there's like a junior vice president. It's like, no, we have a way to connect. Again, Dr. Sullivan brought up, is there really a model? And before I get on on a rampage about everyone's showing these slides of Venn diagrams and flow charts and all this other stuff, I think there needs to be some principles in place to say, how do people communicate? How do people oversee things? How do people report a basic report? I know how to see someone do like a sales report. Okay, that's kind of like, you could probably Google that. I'm not saying that's the process that you use. And obviously, you want to do something internal and more formal. But like, there is no starting point to say, how do we know that the strength coach, does he do a report at the end of the year and say, hey, this is our injuries, this is why we can do better? Is there anything mature?
No, I mean,
it might be
I know, like I'm talking to some people about, what happens at the end of an NFL season and how many are the players interviewed by the strength coach, or do you get feedback on how things went? Are the individual groups, the sports scientists, the strength coach, the medical people, are they meeting and going, hey, what did we do well? What can we improve on? And I'm finding it's not necessarily done all the time.
Let's say, just round for convenient numbers, 30 teams. And forget about if it's football or not. Let's say just the general leagues that we have in North America. Could you say that there's like this really like connected, everyone's on the same page, or there's everyone's putting on a nice face and they're thinking about job preservation?
Yes.
The issue is that my problem is when people say we believe in working in teams are usually the people that are in charge of teams, meaning the top, because what they like is the fact that there are people to fire underneath you. It's sort of like I'm not saying it's like a plague, but you can see people on the lower part of the village before the king starts to get the problem. And not to bring up feudal models of disease, but we tend to see the little guy getting canned first, then the coordinators, and then the team, then management, then the athletic director. The further away from the people that own the team or run the team, the more likely of them to keep their jobs. Let's be honest. It's changing now because people are so impatient with turning around things. I understand where that is. So where I go is that, can someone show something that everyone can say, it's not a perfect end of year meeting, but let's just start with that because we have nothing in place. Like, there's a book called, I think it's like the 21-minute meeting, and I go through the bookstore and just trying to, have some light reading and saying, well, I'm not saying that's the perfect meeting, but I like brief meetings, because when you have these long meetings, that's when people tune out, or maybe you have to meet more frequently standing up. There's all these little ways to communicate better.
Yeah, the TED meeting, right? Like,
yeah, the TED meeting. But what's happened is, with maybe 50 or 60 quote guerrilla marketing, leadership books, I can say that the sort of like the teen vampire romance section of a Barnes and Noble, we're seeing more and more leadership books, but are we seeing an improvement in leadership? It's always the same. It's bizarre. We're seeing people quote like Marcus Aurelius from from Roman civilizations, but it's like, okay, are things aren't getting better now? We have to resort to the past because we can't do it in the present. How many books about Steve Jobs? It's like 1 million, but like, is Steve Jobs is Steve Jobs. It's like he can get away with that because the guy's talented. If I was doing that, oh, he's a jerk because I'm not as talented as Steve Jobs, right? You only get to the brilliant people have their own rules. So I think that it would be good for someone to tackle this, because this is not as exciting as the 400-pound bench club. I mean, that is a way to say, okay, I'm not saying it's a goal for any sport, but it was an attempt to say, hey, here's what we're doing. We got more records in the weight room. Hey, at least someone has something in place. Not saying it's the best practice for any means, but I think that we have to have something that people are sharing. The issue of this day and age with all this social sharing is we're getting more compartmentalized with people thinking that they have either secrets or they're not open. So, like, if you really have something that can help the field or profession, it should be released. Like, end of year meeting. If the end of year meeting is winning you games, fine. Like, I can understand you hiding that. But if that's just helping people get better or people not getting hurt, I think that should be a little bit more open source to the field, because I think there's something to be said for protecting the wellness of the athlete. And, sports are in trouble. I'm not saying that in 2 years it's going to be extinct and we're all going to be playing, Angry Birds and no one's going to want to do sports. But what's happening isn't working. And it's more than just the youth level, because at all levels things have problems. So I think the three ways that I would address this, I want to say fix it, is to come up with some sort of standards of reporting. So those that do get hired, I think a hiring process discussion is saying, okay, if the head coach got hired because whoever under them got fired, you're probably looking at more of like, who do you trust and who is doing the right job versus your buddy, or because there is a loyalty.
Yep.
Everyone expects that their opportunity is going to come from, people that they work from, that they'll get on their Noah's Ark. They'll bring in their, they'll come, who's coming with me, the type of thing like
Yep.
Jerry Maguire. And I understand, for me, like I've done that where I've hired people that I knew as assistants. When I was coaching high school, my former assistant, I rehired him, not only because he was good, it's because I could trust him.
Yeah, but also importantly, he was good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because when your intentions are either to try to win ethically, and you want to keep your job. I mean, there's a whole point where there's some coaches, that was, I'm not sure what happened is, but some coaches, they get into a scandal. Look at Bountygate. I'm not sure what happened to the defensive coordinator, but that was probably arguably a hard problem afterwards, but on the other hand is that people say, well, if there is something to go wrong, I want to know that guy's got my back. And that gets back to what's the ethics. If you're trying to, what is your intent? Something's happened. You yell at an athlete, your program, you got greedy, you want to develop speed, maybe did a couple more reps of 30-meter flies. That's much dramatically different when there's a line that I think is coming out when you know better, but you choose not to because either the head coach told you to do it and you want to make sure you keep your job. And this is happening on the other side of the spectrum. Derek, while we all are worried about what happened to people getting hospitalized, people are getting hurt the other way around too.
Yep. People
are underprepared, especially what we're seeing now with basketball is we're seeing, well, we're doing meditation training.
Yep.
Because I don't want to get my guy upset at me because we're doing conditioning or we're lifting weights and he's tired, or I let him eat garbage because I don't want to be the bad guy. The buddy coach is just the opposite.
Oh, sure.
There needs to be something in the middle of saying, hey, let's be responsible. I'm saying that the silent epidemic is really the buddy coach, which is doing everything besides strength and conditioning. Right?
Yep.
There's one NBA strength coach that is talking about sleep, and he's talking about nutrition, he's talking about strength and conditioning, but then when you see things on, ESPN, like, behind the, whatever special that they have on a player that's retiring or whatever, you see just the cardinal opposite, which is he's waking up at 4 a.m. to see the sunrise to get ready, that type of thing. So anyway, sorry about that. The battery is pretty much dying.
Okay. Well, just a quick last question. If you could just fire
Sure.
off a couple of things. If you're at the University of Oregon, how do you make this better? Like, I know, okay, you've suspended the guy, and you have a sports science guy, but how do they move forward? And I think you touched on it. Part of it is the transparency and like being open about what we're doing. But what would you do?
I think you own it, and then you come up with a model for it not to ever happen again, so that you can give it to trickle down to high schools, so that it becomes. I'm not saying you got to come up with the Oregon rule, right?
Mm-hmm.
You don't want to immortalize something that happened, but it's fair enough to say, hey, listen, there was clearly an issue that was an impairment, to say the least. And I think the first thing is to say, okay, amplify the problem, put it underneath the microscope, and say, how can we do better to help people? And when you're trying to help people, the direction's good. When you're trying to make sure who's responsible, who gets the credit, who reports to who, I think the main thing is to say, if you really wanted to treat the athlete like they were your son or daughter, what would you do differently? And if you always think it like that, like what can you do to help a neighbor? It's going to be much different than saying, how do we win games, or how do we get a competitive advantage? So I think if you start there, it sounds cheesy, and people will say things. It's sort of like leadership. But I think the difference is if you come up with a system and saying, hey, we want to share what we're doing, and invite people to say, this is what we've learned. And I think I don't know if there's any what the long-term prognosis is. That's, I'm not a doctor, but I think that's the first step, is to say, hey, admit it and say, this is what we're going to do. And they've announced that already, which is a great sign forward. I think that's the key. And then I also think that sometimes you need to have an external audit. So, that's something I think there's a market for that. Not to say, okay, ambulance chasing, but I think there needs to be a role for someone to start saying, hey, this is not new. The rhabdo is a symptom rather than the problem, and here's what we can do better. Because not having rhabdo isn't success. I think that's my last little statement.
Good, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot of people watching that program very closely, but I think you brought up some very good points. So I look forward to talking to you more, and we'll do a follow-up on this very soon. Thank you, Carl.
Yeah, and there's some great people there, and there's an amazing track coach, and there's a bunch of great track coaches, and there's some other good sport coaches too. I think, I'm feeling for Oregon. A lot of people are salivating because they just love to pile on,
mm-hmm.
and that doesn't help anyone to do that. It's okay to be brave and say, hey, we got to be accountable, but we all have eyes. That's my whole sentence. When someone tells me the obvious, I always look at them and say, I have eyes, because I think that's quoting the obvious. So there's some great people there, and it's a great university. So let's be here to try to support each other, rather than take advantage of saying, thank God it's happening over there, it makes me look better. So I think that's kind of selfish. So I think if as a community we can kind of work together, I think there's going to be something productive out of it. And look forward to talking to you more.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Carl.
All right. Thanks, Derek.
So I hope you enjoyed that discussion. And as always, we're looking for your further feedback to continue the discussion and delve into some more details on this incident and just gathering your thoughts. So if you want to leave some comments, please visit Strength Power Speed. That's our handle with no vowels, Strength Power Speed, on both Facebook, Twitter, and we'll also be posting on YouTube on our channel there, which is also Strength Power Speed. So thank you very much for listening, and we hope to hear from you.